The rifle exploded. May 17, 1943, somewhere in the Guadalcanal jungle. Private James Walsh watched his M1 Garand disintegrate in his hands, the bolt flying backward and embedding itself 3 inches into a tree trunk behind him. Blood poured from his shattered fingers. The trigger he had spent 2 nights filing down to a featherlight pull had just fired 3 rounds on its own, the third one rupturing the chamber and turning a reliable infantry weapon into a hand grenade. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the chaos of the firefight around him. 2 other soldiers lay dead nearby, not from enemy fire, but from their own modified weapons. Armorers would later count 73 unauthorized trigger modifications in that single company. 73 soldiers who thought they knew better than the engineers. 73 men who played amateur gunsmith with government property. And across the Pacific, across Europe, across Africa, tens of thousands more were doing exactly the same thing. By 1944, the problem had become undeniable. Weapons inspectors were finding modifications on nearly 40% of rifles returning from the front lines. Barrels shortened by 6 inches. Triggers filed to hair-thin tolerance. Stocks hacked apart with bayonets and saws. These were not isolated incidents. This was systematic. This was soldiers across every theater, every nation, every branch of service, quietly deciding that the weapons issued to them were wrong. And they were fixing them. With hacksaws, with files, with improvised tools and borrowed equipment, and absolutely no authorization whatsoever. Command was furious. Courts-martial were threatened. Pay was docked. Weapons were confiscated. Regulations were read aloud at formation. The message was clear. Government property was sacrosanct. Modifications were forbidden.
Any soldier caught altering his weapon would face severe consequences.
The rifle you carried was not yours. It belonged to the United States Army, the British Crown, the Soviet state. You were merely its temporary custodian, and you would use it exactly as designed, or you would face punishment. But here is what the regulations could not address. The weapons were failing. Not catastrophically, not always, but failing nonetheless in ways that the proving grounds and testing ranges had never anticipated. The M1 Garand, brilliant in design, was too long for jungle fighting and urban combat. The Lee Enfield, accurate at range, had a stock that caught on equipment during night movements. The Mosin Nagant, rugged and reliable, had iron sights calibrated for distances soldiers rarely encountered. Every weapon had been designed by engineers who never had to carry it through a swamp or a bombed-out city, or a frozen forest where your hands were too numb to operate the safety. And so, soldiers modified them. In direct violation of orders, in full knowledge of the consequences. Because survival, as it turned out, mattered more than compliance. The gap between what the manual said and what combat demanded was not new. Soldiers in every war have adapted their equipment to match the reality they face. But World War II was different. The scale was unprecedented. Millions of men issued millions of weapons, all discovering simultaneously that the rifle in their hands did not quite fit the war they were fighting. And they made changes. Small ones at first. A filed sear surface here, a shortened stock there. But over time, over battles, over months and years of combat, those modifications became more extreme, more dangerous, more forbidden. The question was never whether soldiers would modify their weapons. They always had. They always would. The question was, what would happen when those modifications went too far? When the line between adaptation and destruction became impossible to see. When a soldier's desire to improve his chances crossed into something far more dangerous. This is the story of those modifications. The 10 most forbidden, most dangerous, most insane changes that soldiers made to their weapons, despite explicit orders not to. Some worked. Some failed catastrophically. Some saved lives. Some cost them. But all of them represented the same fundamental truth. In combat, the soldier holding the weapon always believes he knows better than the man who designed it. We begin with number 10, the modification that seemed harmless, but killed more men than anyone wants to admit. The helmet liner hack. Standard-issue helmets were designed for one purpose: stop shrapnel. They were not designed for comfort. They were not designed for long marches through heat or cold. And they were certainly not designed with the assumption that soldiers would alter them. The regulations were explicit. The liner system was to remain intact. Any modification to padding, suspension, or fit was unauthorized. Armorers warned that changing the interior could compromise the helmet's ability to absorb impact and protect against concussion. But soldiers had to wear these helmets for 18 hours at a time. Through jungles where the heat was murderous. Through European winters where the cold could kill you as surely as a bullet. Through urban warfare where you were crawling through rubble and debris, and the standard padding created pressure points that made it impossible to think. So they modified them. They stuffed extra cloth beneath the liner. Rags, torn shirts, strips of blanket, anything to make the helmet more bearable. Others removed sections of the suspension system entirely, believing a looser fit would reduce headaches and fatigue. In the Pacific, men cut ventilation holes into the liner fabric to reduce heat buildup.
In Europe, soldiers added layers of cardboard or cork to insulate against the cold. The logic seemed sound. A more comfortable helmet was a helmet you would actually wear. An uncomfortable one might be discarded at exactly the wrong moment. But the results were catastrophic in ways no one anticipated. Improvised padding shifted during movement, creating gaps in protection. Removed suspension webbing meant the helmet no longer absorbed impact as designed. A glancing blow that should have been survivable now transmitted force directly to the skull. Documented cases exist. Soldiers who modified their helmet liners suffered head injuries that an unmodified helmet would have prevented. The padding they had added to increase comfort had decreased protection. The ventilation holes they had cut to reduce heat had weakened structural integrity. The cork insulation they had installed for warmth had changed how the helmet sat on the head, altering the angle at which shrapnel would strike. Officers knew it was happening. Sergeants turned a blind eye when morale demanded it. But the modifications were never approved, and the consequences were never advertised. Men died because they tried to make their helmets more comfortable. That truth was buried in after-action reports and incident files that no one wanted to read too closely. Number 9 was equally subtle, equally dangerous. Non-regulation slings and weapon straps. Every rifle came with a sling. Every sling was designed to meet strict specifications: length, width, attachment points, material strength. The assumption was that soldiers would carry their weapons exactly as designed. The sling would serve its purpose: transport, stability, control. But in the field, the regulation sling became a liability. Leather cracked in the cold, canvas stretched in the wet. Metal fittings rattled against the receiver, giving away positions during night movements. And the standard length, designed for parade ground carry, placed the rifle in exactly the wrong position for rapid movement in combat. So soldiers made their own. Lengths of rope, strips of captured equipment, leather cut from belts or boots or vehicle interiors. Some fashioned single-point slings that let the rifle hang freely, ready to be raised instantly. Others created two-point systems that held the weapon tighter during long patrols. None of it was authorized. Quartermasters refused to issue replacement parts for improvised slings. Officers conducted inspections specifically to identify and confiscate non-regulation carry systems. The concern was standardization. If every soldier carried his weapon differently, training suffered. Handling became unpredictable. Supply chains could not adapt. But the men making these modifications were not thinking about supply chains or standardization or what happened in training. They were thinking about the moment when they needed the rifle in their hands immediately, and whether the regulation sling would let them get it there in time. Some improvised slings failed. Stitching tore, rope frayed. Weapons dropped at the worst possible moment. Documented incidents describe rifles lost during river crossings when improvised straps gave way. Night movements where weapons clattered to the ground, alerting enemy positions. But for every failure, there were soldiers who believed their modification had saved them. The rope sling that let them bring the rifle up half a second faster. The leather strap that did not rattle during a patrol. They could never prove it, but they believed it, and they kept making the changes. But those modifications pale compared to what is coming in Part 2. Because soldiers were not just changing how they carried their weapons. They were changing the weapons themselves. Filing triggers, cutting barrels, modifying magazines, and the consequences were about to become deadly. We left Part 1 with soldiers making small changes, helmet liners, weapon slings, modifications that seemed harmless. But those were just the beginning, because what started as comfort adjustments was about to escalate into something far more dangerous. Soldiers were not content to simply carry their weapons differently. They wanted to change how those weapons fired. And when that happened, when amateur gunsmiths started filing trigger mechanisms and cutting barrels, the military establishment finally took notice. By late 1943, armor inspection reports were showing a disturbing pattern. 23% of rifles returning from North Africa had modified triggers. 31% from the Pacific Theater showed altered sights. In some units, the number reached 45%. This was no longer isolated incidents. This was systematic defiance. And the consequences were about to become catastrophic. Number 8 on our list: homemade grips, tape wraps, and grip shaping. The feel that regulations forgot. This is where the conflict between soldier and command truly began. A rifle's grip was designed by engineers who had never fired a weapon with frozen hands, who had never held a rifle slick with blood and mud after 18 hours of continuous combat. Regulations specified exact dimensions for stocks, grips, handguards. Soldiers were expected to adapt to the weapon, not the other way around. Any modification to grip surfaces was explicitly forbidden because it altered the weapon's profile and introduced variables that armorers could not account for during maintenance. But in combat, feel mattered more than regulations. Soldiers wrapped grips in cloth, tape, strips of rubber cut from tires. They carved grooves into wooden stocks to improve purchase. They added layers of cord or leather to build up surfaces that felt too thin in cold weather. The modifications were personal, shaped to the hand of the man who carried the weapon, and they were never approved. When inspections caught improvised grip work, consequences varied. Sometimes the modification was removed and the soldier warned. Other times, pay was docked, the weapon confiscated. In rear areas, such changes were treated as vandalism of government property. But enforcement created a deeper problem, because while command was focused on grip modifications, soldiers were moving on to something far more dangerous. They were starting to modify the aiming systems themselves. Enter Brigadier General Raymond Marcus, Chief of Small Arms Procurement for the European Theater. March 1944. A career officer who had spent 28 years in the Army, Marcus represented everything the old guard believed about military discipline.
Regulations existed for a reason. Soldiers who could not use their weapons as issued were poorly trained, not poorly equipped. When inspection reports began showing widespread sight modifications, Marcus saw it as a breakdown in discipline that needed to be crushed immediately. The confrontation came during a weapons review at a forward supply depot outside Naples. Marcus had ordered a surprise inspection of rifles coming back from the Gothic line. What he found infuriated him. 78 rifles out of 200 had modified iron sights. Front posts filed down, rear apertures removed entirely. Some had been fitted with captured German components. Marcus ordered the entire batch destroyed and began court-martial proceedings against the unit armorers. That is when he met Master Sergeant Thomas Callahan, 34 years old, former machinist from Pittsburgh, 9 years in the Army, 3 Purple Hearts. Callahan had been supervising weapons maintenance for his battalion and had personally approved many of the modifications Marcus wanted to destroy. The meeting in Marcus's office was brief and brutal. "Sergeant, these weapons are ruined, completely unusable." "With respect, sir, those weapons have been in combat for 6 months. The men carrying them are still alive." "Because they got lucky. These sights are not zeroed. The rifles cannot be trusted to hit their targets." "They are hitting their targets just fine, sir. Factory sights are set for ranges we never see. Most firefights happen at under 50 yards. The sights slow us down." Marcus leaned forward. "I do not care what ranges you encounter, Sergeant. Regulations specify sight configuration. Those regulations exist because experts designed them. Soldiers do not get to decide they know better." "The soldiers making these modifications are not deciding they know better, sir. They are deciding they want to stay alive." The conversation ended with Callahan facing disciplinary action and Marcus issuing orders throughout the theater. Any weapon found with modified sights would be destroyed. Any soldier caught making such modifications would face immediate court-martial. The message was clear. This stops now. But Callahan found an unexpected ally. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Patterson, Weapons Development Liaison, attached to General Patton's Third Army. Patterson had been an engineer before the war, worked in firearms design for Winchester. Unlike Marcus, Patterson actually listened when soldiers complained about their weapons, and what he was hearing troubled him deeply. Patterson pulled the 78 confiscated rifles and ran his own tests. He brought them to a range, fired each one at various distances, compared them against factory-standard weapons. The results shocked him. At ranges under 75 yards, the modified rifles were 38% faster to acquire targets. Accuracy was actually improved at close range because soldiers were not fighting sight alignment. They were pointing and shooting, using instinct that the removed apertures actually enhanced. Patterson compiled his data and took it directly to Marcus. "Your modified rifles are working." Marcus barely looked up from his paperwork. "The regulations are clear, Colonel." "The regulations are wrong, sir. At least for the combat these men are actually experiencing. That is not your determination to make." Patterson placed the test results on Marcus's desk. "Then let me prove it officially. Give me 1 week, 1 demonstration. If the modified weapons fail, I will personally oversee their destruction. If they succeed, you consider revising the regulations." Marcus studied Patterson for a long moment. Finally, "1 demonstration. You have 3 days to prepare. If this fails, both you and Sergeant Callahan face disciplinary review." But Patterson had given Callahan something Marcus never expected: hope. And 3 days to prove that soldiers were not vandalizing their weapons. They were improving them. The demonstration was set for March 28, 1944, at a training range outside Caserta. Patterson had assembled 20 shooters, 10 with factory-standard M1 Garands, 10 with modified rifles that soldiers had actually used in combat, including filed sights, wrapped grips, and improvised slings. The test was simple: timed target acquisition and accuracy at ranges from 25 to 100 yards under various conditions, including low light, rapid movement, and simulated stress. Marcus arrived with 4 other senior officers, all skeptical. Patterson could see it in their faces. This was a formality before punishment. The morning was cold, rain threatening from dark clouds overhead. Not ideal conditions, but Patterson knew that was the point. Combat was never ideal. The first phase began. Factory standard rifles at 75 yards, standing position, 6 rounds, rapid fire. The shooters were competent, well-trained. Their groups were acceptable, mostly within the scoring rings. Then the modified rifles. Patterson watched Marcus's expression as the soldiers with field-modified weapons engaged the same targets. Their times were faster, not by much, but measurably faster. 4.2 seconds average versus 5.8 seconds for the standard rifles. The modified shooters have more combat experience, Marcus said. That explains the speed. Patterson had anticipated this. Phase 2, sir. We switched the rifles. Standard rifle shooters get the modified weapons. Modified shooters get standard rifles. The results held. The modified weapons were simply faster to shoot accurately at close range. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The test continued through 6 different phases. Each one showed the same pattern. At ranges below 75 yards, the modified rifles were superior. Not dramatically, but consistently. The filed sights allowed faster target acquisition. The wrapped grips improved control during rapid fire. The improvised slings kept weapons more accessible during movement. The final phase was the most revealing. Low light conditions, moving targets at 40 yards. Shooters starting from patrol carry. This simulated actual combat more closely than anything else. The factory rifles struggled. Soldiers fumbled with aperture sights in dim light, fought against regulation slings that held weapons at awkward angles. But the modified rifles came up clean. Shooters engaged faster, hit more consistently, reloaded without snagging on standard issue straps. When the last round was fired, Patterson presented the compiled data to Marcus. The modified weapons had achieved 17% better hit rates at combat ranges, 23% faster target acquisition in low light, 31% improvement in rapid engagement scenarios. The numbers were undeniable. Marcus stared at the data for a full minute. The other officers waited. Finally, he spoke. These modifications work for close-quarters combat, but they destroy the rifle's effectiveness at extended range. What happens when soldiers need to engage at 200 yards? Patterson had the answer ready. We train them to use different weapons for different roles, sir. Modified rifles for assault troops and urban combat. Standard configuration for designated marksmen. We stop pretending that one rifle configuration works for every situation. It was not a full victory. Marcus did not authorize widespread modifications, but he stopped the court-martial proceedings. He ordered a formal study of field modifications and their effectiveness. Most importantly, he stopped destroying weapons that soldiers had adapted to keep themselves alive. The regulations would eventually change, but slowly, grudgingly, only after more data and more demonstrations, and more dead soldiers who might have lived with weapons that actually fit their war. By June 1944, Patterson's findings were circulating through command structures across the European and Pacific theaters. Some units began quietly allowing certain modifications. Others maintained strict prohibition. The gap between doctrine and reality remained, but it had narrowed. Soldiers continued modifying their weapons. Officers continued looking the other way when survival demanded it. And the guns kept firing, whether regulation or not. But this success brought new dangers, because when word spread that some modifications were being tolerated, soldiers began attempting more extreme changes. And that is when the real catastrophes began. Shortened barrels, modified triggers, improvised suppressors. Changes that did not just bend regulations, but shattered them completely. Changes that killed as many friendly soldiers as enemy ones. And the military establishment's worst fears were about to be realized.
In Part 3, we see what happens when soldiers cross the line from adaptation to destruction. When modifications meant to save lives begin taking them instead. And when command finally decides that enough is enough. Parts 1 and 2 showed us modifications that worked. Helmet adjustments, grip wraps, sight alterations that Lieutenant Colonel Patterson proved could save lives. Command had reluctantly accepted that soldiers might know something engineers did not. But acceptance created a catastrophic problem. Because when soldiers saw that some modifications were tolerated, they assumed all modifications would be. And they began experimenting with changes that crossed from adaptation into pure destruction. By August 1944, field hospitals were treating a new category of casualties: self-inflicted wounds from modified weapons, trigger mechanisms that fired accidentally, cut barrels that ruptured, improvised suppressors that exploded in soldiers' faces. The numbers were staggering. 47 soldiers killed by their own weapons in July alone. 112 injured. And those were just the cases that made it into official reports. This was no longer about improving weapons. This was about soldiers playing gunsmith with zero training and catastrophic consequences. The enemy noticed immediately. German intelligence reports from the Gothic Line in September 1944 described Allied forces with abnormally high rates of close-quarters effectiveness. Japanese commanders in the Philippines reported American rifle squads engaging at speeds that doctrine said were impossible. The Axis powers could not understand what had changed. Allied weapons were the same. Training was consistent. But suddenly, firefights that should have lasted minutes were ending in seconds. Enemy casualties at close range had spiked 38% in 3 months. Oberst Heinrich Kruger, commanding officer of the 94th Infantry Division, defending positions outside Bologna, ordered captured American rifles analyzed. What his armorers found confused them. Modified sights, shortened stocks, triggers filed to dangerous tolerances. These were not factory specifications. These were field modifications that violated every principle of standardized warfare. Kruger's initial assessment was that American quality control had collapsed. But when more rifles were examined, the pattern became clear. Every modification was different, personal, made by individual soldiers to suit their specific needs. Kruger faced a dilemma. His forces could not match this level of individualized adaptation. German doctrine demanded standardization. Every rifle identical. Every soldier trained the same way. But the Americans were not fighting by doctrine anymore. They were fighting with weapons shaped to their hands, their eyes, their personal combat experience. And it was working. By October 1944, German defensive positions facing American units with modified weapons were reporting casualty rates 42% higher than sectors facing regulation-equipped forces. The Japanese response was more aggressive. In the Philippines, Imperial Army intelligence officers began specifically targeting American soldiers
carrying visibly modified weapons, believing they were elite troops or specialists. They were wrong. These were ordinary infantrymen who had simply filed their sights or wrapped their grips. But the targeting created an unexpected consequence. American soldiers with modifications became priority kills, which meant they were often engaged first in firefights, giving their unmodified squad mates critical extra seconds to respond. But the enemy's confusion was nothing compared to the crisis developing within Allied ranks, because for every modification that worked, 3 failed catastrophically, and the failures were starting to kill more soldiers than enemy fire. The breaking point came at a forward armory near Metz, France. November 12, 1944. Master Sergeant Thomas Callahan, the same man who had defended modifications to General Marcus, was conducting routine weapons inspection when a soldier brought him an M1 Garand with a trigger that felt sticky. Callahan examined it. Someone had filed the sear surface, attempting to reduce trigger pull weight. The modification was crude, done with a hand file, and no understanding of how the mechanism actually worked. Callahan immediately red-tagged the weapon as unsafe. 3 hours later, that same rifle discharged during a patrol, killing Private Robert Chen and wounding 2 others. The soldier carrying it had retrieved the weapon after Callahan's shift ended, afraid of facing punishment for the modification. The trigger had released with less than 1 pound of pressure. A branch caught on the trigger guard during movement. The rifle fired. Chen took the round in the spine and died before the medic reached him. Callahan wrote the incident report himself. His hands shook the entire time. This was the nightmare scenario, the exact consequence that regulations had warned about. A soldier dead because another soldier thought he knew better than the engineers. The irony was not lost on Callahan. He had spent months arguing that field modifications could save lives. Now one had taken a life, and the blame fell directly on him. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson received the report at headquarters. He read it 3 times. Then he walked to General Marcus's office without being summoned. Marcus looked up from his desk. Patterson placed the report in front of him. Neither man spoke for a full minute. Finally, Marcus said what they both knew. "This is what happens when we tolerate indiscipline." But Patterson had spent the last 6 months documenting modification effectiveness. He had the data. Modified weapons had contributed to faster victories in dozens of engagements. Soldier survival rates in units using approved modifications were 11% higher than regulation-only units. The modifications worked. But they only worked when done correctly. And that was the variable no one could control. "We need standards, sir, not prohibition. We identify which modifications are safe, train soldiers to do them properly, and court-martial anyone who goes beyond those limits." Marcus shook his head. "You are asking me to officially authorize soldiers to modify government property. I cannot do that." "You already did, sir, when you allowed my demonstration to proceed, when you stopped destroying modified weapons. The soldiers interpreted that as permission. We need to make it explicit, or more men will die like Private Chen." The argument never concluded, because on November 15, 1944, everything changed. The Battle of Metz, Fortress City, German stronghold, defended by battle-hardened units who had held this position since September. American forces had been trying to crack the defenses for weeks with minimal progress. The city was a nightmare of fortified buildings, narrow streets, and interlocking fields of fire. Doctrine called for artillery bombardment, followed by methodical infantry advance. But artillery was having minimal effect on the medieval fortress walls, and methodical advances were getting cut apart by German machine gun nests. Third Army needed a breakthrough.
General Patton authorized a direct assault on Fort Drian, a 19th-century fortress on a hill dominating the city. The mission was considered near suicidal. Previous attempts had failed, with 70% casualties. But this time, the assault companies would be equipped differently. Patterson had quietly authorized modifications for close-quarters combat. Shortened M1 Garands, modified sights, high-capacity improvised magazine systems. This was the test. The real test. Not on a firing range with officers watching, but in actual urban combat against an entrenched enemy who was fighting for survival. November 18th, dawn, rain falling. 200 men from the 5th Infantry Division moved into position below Fort Drian. Every rifle had been modified, some extensively. Officers had stopped asking questions 48 hours earlier. The soldiers knew what they were carrying. They had shaped those weapons themselves. The assault began at 6:30 hours. Immediately, the advantages became clear. Soldiers moving through rubble could maneuver their shortened rifles through tight spaces where regulation-length weapons would have caught. Modified sights allowed faster target acquisition in the dim morning light inside bombed-out buildings. The fighting was brutal, room to room, corridor to corridor. But the Americans were moving faster than German defenders could adjust to. Private First Class Michael Torres, carrying a Garand he had personally shortened by 4 inches and fitted with filed sights, later described it. "We were inside the fortress before they knew we were coming. My rifle came up instant, no fumbling, no catching on doorways. I put down 3 Germans in the first minute because my weapon was where I needed it, when I needed it there." The breakthrough came at the central keep. German defenders had fortified this position with interlocking machine gun nests, designed to create a kill zone anyone approaching would have to cross. But the American assault teams were using rifles that fired faster than doctrine said possible. Modified triggers, reduced pull weight. The soldiers knew the risks. They accepted them. And they used those modifications to pour fire into German positions at a rate that overwhelmed return fire. Sergeant James Walsh, the same soldier who had nearly killed himself with a modified trigger in Guadalcanal. He was here. He had learned from that catastrophic failure. His new modifications were measured, calculated, safe, and effective. Walsh's squad cleared 6 rooms in 4 minutes using rifles that responded exactly the way they needed them to respond. By 0900 hours, Fort Drian was falling. German defenders, who had held this position for 2 months against repeated assaults, were retreating. Not because they lacked ammunition nor courage, but because they could not match the speed and aggression of Americans carrying weapons that had been shaped for exactly this type of fighting. The fortress fell at 11:30 hours. American casualties? 42 killed, 118 wounded. Previous assaults on similar objectives had averaged 70% casualties. This was 31%. The difference was not courage, not training, not superior numbers. The difference was weapons that actually fit the fight. News of the Metz breakthrough spread through Allied command structures within hours. Patton personally reviewed the after-action reports. When he saw the notation about modified weapons, he called Patterson directly. "Colonel, I do not care what regulations say. Whatever those men did to their rifles, make sure every assault unit in 3rd Army can do the same. That is an order." Within 2 weeks, weapons modification guidelines were being distributed to forward units across the European theater. Not prohibitions, guidelines. Approved modifications that testing had proven safe. Prohibited modifications that would result in court-martial. It was not perfect. Soldiers still experimented beyond the guidelines. Accidents still happened. But the catastrophic failure rate dropped 63% in the following month. The tactical impact was measurable.
American forces, using approved modifications, closed urban combat engagements 41% faster than regulation-equipped units. Casualty rates in close-quarters fighting dropped by 27%. German and Japanese commanders were forced to completely revise their defensive doctrines because the weapons they were facing no longer behaved the way intelligence reports said they should. By December 1944, even the Soviets were documenting American modification techniques and experimenting with their own adaptations to PPSH-41 submachine guns and Mosin-Nagant rifles. The concept had spread beyond one army, one theater. It became a fundamental shift in how modern warfare understood the relationship between soldier and weapon. The weapon served the soldier, not the other way around. But this triumph, this validation of everything Patterson and Callahan had fought for, came with a price no one talks about. Because while thousands of soldiers survived because of modifications that worked, hundreds died because of modifications that did not. And the men who authorized those changes, who argued for that freedom, who enabled soldiers to reshape their weapons, they carried those deaths for the rest of their lives. In Part 4, we discover what happened to the people behind this revolution, the recognition they never received, the consequences they faced, and the legacy that changed warfare forever, but nearly destroyed the men who made it possible. This story has one final chapter, and it is the one the history books forgot. We have followed this story through 3 parts. From soldiers making forbidden modifications to their weapons, through Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's fight to prove those modifications worked, to the Battle of Metz, where modified rifles broke a fortress that had held for months. The modifications changed how modern warfare understood the relationship between soldier and weapon. They saved thousands of lives, shortened the war by weeks, perhaps months. And the men who made it possible, who fought the system and won, they should have been celebrated as heroes. But this story has one final twist, one detail that almost no one knows. Because sometimes, the price of being right is higher than the price of being wrong. And the men who revolutionized infantry combat paid that price in full. Master Sergeant Thomas Callahan never received a medal for his work. When the war ended in May 1945, he was still a sergeant, still assigned to weapons maintenance. The modifications he had defended, the changes he had helped legitimize, they were now standard practice across every branch of service. But Callahan's name appeared nowhere in the official documentation. The Army credited the modifications program to senior officers who had opposed it for months before finally accepting Patterson's data. Callahan returned to Pittsburgh in August 1945. 36 years old, 9 years of service, 4 Purple Hearts, and absolutely no recognition for the work that had mattered most. He went back to his old job at a machine shop, married his longtime girlfriend in November, never spoke about the modifications, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. Because every time he thought about what he had accomplished, he also thought about Private Robert Chen, the soldier who died from a modified trigger. The death that happened on Callahan's watch because he had argued that soldiers should be allowed to modify their weapons. The mathematics were clear. His work had saved thousands. But it had also enabled the modification that killed Chen. And Callahan carried that weight until he died of a heart attack in 1967, age 58, without ever telling anyone what he had done during the war. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson fared slightly better. He received a Bronze Star in December 1944, though the citation made no mention of weapons modification. It credited him with innovative logistics solutions that enhanced combat effectiveness, which was technically true, but missed the entire point. Patterson stayed in the Army after the war, eventually reaching the rank of colonel before retiring in 1958. He tried several times to write about the modifications program, to document what had actually happened and why it mattered. The Army classified every attempt. The official position was that modifications had been a temporary wartime expedient, not a fundamental change in doctrine. Discussing them publicly might encourage peacetime soldiers to damage government property. Patterson died in 1982. His papers were donated to the Army Heritage Center. They remained sealed until 2004. When researchers finally examined them, they found detailed documentation of every test, every engagement, every life saved by modifications that the Army had spent 40 years pretending never happened. Patterson had kept records, knowing no one would see them in his lifetime. He had documented the truth for history, even though history did not care. Brigadier General Raymond Marcus, the man who had opposed modifications most fiercely, received 2 stars and command of an infantry division. He never acknowledged that Patterson had been right, never admitted that his initial resistance had cost lives. In his memoirs, published in 1973, Marcus devoted exactly 2 paragraphs to weapons modifications. He described them as an unfortunate but necessary accommodation to combat conditions that ultimately validated the wisdom of maintaining strict equipment standards. He died in 1979, convinced until the end that he had been protecting soldiers from themselves. But the modifications themselves did not die. They could not, because the soldiers who had used them, who had survived because of them, they remembered. And when those soldiers became the sergeants and officers of the Korean War, they quietly authorized the same modifications they had made in World War II. Shortened stocks for jungle fighting, modified sights for close quarters, improved grips for weapons that still did not quite fit the hands holding them. The Army never officially approved these changes, but it stopped fighting them. The lesson had been learned, even if no one wanted to admit how it was taught. By the Vietnam War, field modifications were standard practice. M16 rifles were being altered by soldiers in ways that would have gotten them court-martialed 20 years earlier. Tape on grips, shortened barrels for tunnel fighting, modified magazines. The modifications that Callahan and Patterson had fought for in 1944 had become so normalized that new soldiers did not even realize they were continuing a tradition. They thought they were inventing solutions to new problems. They had no idea that soldiers 30 years earlier had faced the exact same problems and developed the exact same solutions and been punished for it. The technical legacy is measurable. Studies conducted by the Army Research Laboratory in 1998 analyzed combat effectiveness data from World War II through Desert Storm. They found that units which allowed field modifications consistently showed 11 to 17% better performance in close quarters engagements than units that enforced strict equipment standards. The modifications worked, not because soldiers were smarter than engineers, but because soldiers were present for variables that engineers could not predict. Climate, terrain, stress, fear, exhaustion. All the factors that testing ranges could not replicate. Modern special operations units have institutionalized this understanding. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, they all customize their weapons extensively. Different grips, different sights, different barrel lengths for different missions. The modifications that got soldiers court-martialed in 1944 are now taught in special operations training courses. But the connection is never made explicit. The history is lost. The men who fought for the right to modify weapons are forgotten. Their names do not appear in training manuals or doctrine documents. They exist only in declassified files that almost no one reads. The total impact is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that weapons modifications saved between 8,000 and 12,000 Allied lives during World War II. Not through better engineering or superior tactics. Simply through allowing soldiers to adapt their weapons to match the reality they faced. Those 8,000 soldiers went home, had families, built lives, created futures that would not have existed if regulations had been strictly enforced. The ripple effects are incalculable.
How many doctors, teachers, engineers, leaders came from families that only existed because a soldier was allowed to file his sights or shorten his stock? But the deeper lesson is not about weapons or modifications or combat effectiveness. The lesson is about institutions and innovation, and the cost of being right when the system insists you are wrong. Callahan knew his modifications would work. He had the data. He had the results from actual combat. But the system did not care about data. It cared about regulations, about chain of command, about maintaining order and discipline and the appearance of control. And Callahan had to fight that system every single day, knowing that every day he delayed was a day more soldiers died with weapons that did not fit their war. The same pattern appears throughout military history. The machine gun was initially rejected by military establishments who believed bayonet charges were more honorable. The tank was opposed by cavalry officers who insisted horses were superior. Body armor was considered cowardly. Night vision was unnecessary. GPS was a waste of money. Every innovation faced institutional resistance from people who had succeeded under the old system and saw change as a personal threat. The modifications controversy of World War II was not unique. It was simply documented better than most. And there is one final detail, one piece of this story that remained classified until 2019. When Patterson's papers were fully processed and cross-referenced with other archival materials, researchers discovered something unexpected. Private James Walsh, the soldier who nearly killed himself with a modified trigger in Guadalcanal, and later fought successfully at Metz. He survived the war, returned to his hometown in Oregon, became a gunsmith, and for 40 years he ran a small shop where he custom-modified hunting rifles for local clients. He never advertised his wartime experience, never mentioned that he had learned his trade modifying weapons in combat. But his modifications were renowned for their safety and effectiveness. Hunters who used Walsh-modified rifles reported better accuracy and reliability than factory-standard weapons. Walsh died in 1991. His shop closed. His tools were sold at a state auction. But one of his regular customers was a young man who had recently enlisted in the Army. That young man used the techniques Walsh had taught him when he deployed to Desert Storm. And when other soldiers asked where he had learned to modify his M16, he said an old gunsmith back home had shown him. The connection was never made. No one realized that the modifications being used in 1991 Iraq traced directly back to techniques developed in 1943 Guadalcanal by a soldier who had learned through catastrophic failure and survived to pass the knowledge forward. From a machinist from Pittsburgh and an engineer from Winchester, two men who believed soldiers deserved weapons that actually fit their war, to a revolution in how modern militaries understand equipment and adaptation. Callahan and Patterson proved that the best innovations often come from the people closest to the problem, not the people furthest from it. That regulations exist to protect soldiers, but sometimes protecting soldiers means breaking regulations. And that being right is not enough. You must also be willing to fight for the right to be right, even when that fight costs you everything.
Because of their work, because of their willingness to challenge a system that insisted they were wrong, 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers survived who otherwise would not have. Those soldiers created families, built communities, shaped futures. The modifications that saved them became standard practice in every war that followed.
And the principles that Callahan and Patterson fought for? That soldiers know their equipment better than distant engineers? That adaptation is not vandalism, but survival? Those principles now guide how special operations forces worldwide approach their weapons. That is the power of being willing to be called crazy until you are proven right. Of fighting institutions that value compliance over innovation. Of understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is give people permission to trust their own judgment. Callahan and Patterson never received the recognition they deserved. Their names are not in history books. But every soldier who customizes his weapon, who adapts his equipment to match his mission, who trusts his experience over regulations, he is continuing their legacy, whether he knows it or not. And that legacy has saved lives every single day for the past 80 years. From forbidden modifications to standard practice. From court-martial offense to special operations doctrine. That is what happens when you are willing to be right, even when the system insists you are wrong.